I am not hearing anything.
Yeah, it's about 30 seconds in.
All right. Then let's go ahead and stop there. That's enough. Um, so you can hear it, there's a very graciousness about it and so forth. I'll talk a little bit more about that music, but I wanted you to hear just a little bit of this because this is early Brahms. But first of all, I want to say this to you. We've already had me have to restart my computer because the audio card in it didn't engage for whatever reason. This is not in my comfort zone. I'm doing something well outside my comfort zone, doing a Zoom call with somebody else helping me and so forth. So just bear with me if we have a little bit of problem here and there. So Brahms, this Opus 16, it's his second serenade, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got into the by that time his Opus 16. But before we do that, I want you to know that this was one of Brahms' very favorite works. He loved this piece. Clara Schumann, who was one of his great advisors, really loved the piece as well. And Brahms arranged more performances himself for this particular piece and conducted them than just about any other piece he ever had. So this is one that is really special to him. It's also special to me. And I don't know if you can see on the screen there, I assume you can, Brahms Serenade in A major, and it has my name, David Bowden. I love this piece so much, and I also saw some things in it that I wanted to engage that I made it the product of my dissertation. And I want to just walk you through how I organized the dissertation because I'm going to do something similar in part for you. So the first area that we talk about is what happened to Brahms. This is early in his life. He was about 25, 26 when he completed this. He was 26 when he completed it. But there were so many things about this particular piece that were shaped by what came before. So you can see I have something about his creative personality. Then I talk about the compositional context. And then I talk about the A major serenade. And then I talked about analysis. We'll get to that later as I go through. But I thought it would be interesting to find for you to see and for me to read for you what was said by one person who wrote a letter to Brahms' very dear friend, Joseph Joachim. And you can read it there, but I'll read it to you. Brahms' Serenade, and this is the second one, is a monstrosity, a caricature, a freak, which should never have been published, much less performed here. We say here, whilst the piano concerto, that's the one, the opus number right before number 16, served up to us last winter, still sticks in our throats. It is inexcusable that such filth should have been offered to a public thirsting for good music. That was an hour, a fiendish torture that can never be forgotten. And then he ends at the very end and says, we will all unite in bidding farewell to Herr Brahms. Do not tax the patience of your audience too severely, and do not impose on them a taste for that which can only be the greatest torture to people with sound ears. So it's an amazing statement. And as you get to know the piece, you'll be like, what? So this, from my perspective, is amazingly written, but it's seldom performed. And I engaged that in the dissertation, but just briefly here, I'm not going to say all that I said there. The problem with Brahms' serenades is his symphonies. His symphonies are so well known and they're so beautifully constructed and they're so incredibly galvanizing when you listen to them that when you go to the serenades, it's not quite the same. It's not like his symphonies. The seriousness, even the D major, the second symphony, has a very fundamental serioususness in its cheerfulness. The Brahms A major serenade is cheerful through and through. In fact, when Brahms completed writing it, he wrote to his friend Joseph Joachim, I mentioned before, a violinist who he was very, very close to, and who was a great critic of Brahms and helped him with some of his early works. He wrote to him and he said, I have had such pleasure writing this. I don't know when I've ever enjoyed something more. So when I was going over things that we put on our Facebook page, there was a post from the THSO office that said Opus 16 was originally much larger, that it had violins, and that Brahms made it smaller and less imposing. And then associated with that particular idea was the idea that it had been dedicated to Clara Schumann. Here's what you see if you go to just first search on in this case Bing, but it would be the same thing on Google. So there's what you get, and it says all of this stuff, and you go, okay, well, that must be good. And so then you click over to it, and you get right here, the second serenade was written in 1859. Well, that's not quite correct. Dedicated to Clara Schumann. No. The first public performance was, and it says, that's correct, but there was actually another performance earlier than that that was kind of public. Brahms himself reworked the piece for four hands piano in 1875. Wrong. He published that also at the same time. And then it goes on to basically say that there was in this particular work a reconstruction that was republished in 1875. So it was not dedicated to Clara. The conducting score that Brahms used when he conducted this was this original. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yep, there it is. So this is the actual score, and it was published in 1860. By the way, there's an interesting story here. So there's a very famous publisher, Breitkopf and Härtel. German publisher, was active in Brahms' time. Brahms was connected with Breitkopf through Joseph Joachim, and he gave a whole bunch of his materials to Breitkopf to have them consider for publication, because he was a young thing. I mean, the guy was in his early 20s. And they chose to publish several things, not all of them, and they rejected this serenade, this small serenade for small orchestra, Kleines Orchestra. Blaseninstrumenta means wind instruments, and then viola, cello, and bass. And they didn't want it. And there was another publisher that was also well known at that time, Simrock, but not somebody that generally would consider somebody as young as Brahms. But Simrock had a son. His name was Fritz. Nikolaus Simrock's son, Fritz, got to know Brahms a little bit because they were in proximity in a particular festival, and he got to know each other. And he went to his dad and said, Dad, I think this guy's got it. I think you could really make some money if you get in early with him. So Simrock published this. It sold like gangbusters, especially because there was the four-hand duet version that Brahms had written, not in 1875, but he published it in 1860, wrote it in 1859. So it basically is a reduction so that when there were no movies and no TV to watch and no radio to listen to, people would do things in their home musically. And this was set up so that they could play the work. And those were probably the biggest selling things through that whole period of time. Anyway, Brahms Serenade is for small orchestra. It never had violins. And there was something in the Wikipedia article that said it at first had a large orchestra with violins, and then he took them out and made it less colorful. is the word. It was less colorful. It was not bright. It was dark. But if you know anything about flutes and oboes and clarinets and bassoons, those are fairly bright instruments. The stringed instruments were the lower string instruments. He provided the foundation for that. And at the very end, a piccolo comes in on the last movement, the fifth movement. So it was a very bright, light piece. And the person who wrote that Wikipedia article went to some bad sources. And in my dissertation, I actually go through that and articulate what the source issues were for that. All right. My interest in this, I am very interested as a conductor in taking a work and taking it from the very beginning all the way through to the very end as one big arc with little things in between that shape it, that make it have gesture, as though I were composing. Not, I'm looking at the notes, but I'm trying to get behind that to the things that are implicit in the music, but which can't be notated. And Brahms is in a period of time when there are certain things that can be done with every phrase and that are normative, but frequently not done today. We'll talk about performance aspect later. But the thing that you have to understand about that is what Schoenberg called the Grundgestalt, or the basic shape, the germinal idea of a piece. And Brahms was one who took a germinal idea, and I'm going to give you a different example now. This is from the D major symphony, symphony number 2. Ya, da, da, da. That's the way it starts in the cellos and basses, and then the horns go ya, da, 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 da. Everything in the whole symphony basically comes from those two things, with a few exceptions as you go along. Well, the same thing is true in this particular A major serenade. He starts with ya da 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 da, so that ya da, that's a perfect fourth. And then going down and then going back up, so the scalar ya da ba da ba da ba da. You've got the scalar thing going up and down. Those things are essential all the way through the whole piece. And so my interest in the dissertation was to see how one should pace that, because there's several places in the piece that I know Brahms was not happy with. It wasn't quite right. And there's actually dialogue in his letters with Clara Schumann about some of this. And how do you put it in its best light? How do you remove the shadow, if you will, from this one area in order to be able to make it sound the best it can? This is true with all music. Every time you play music of any sort, you're always trying to make it have a sense of flow, to make it feel like it's right, and not feel like somehow that was too loud or that was too fast. You want it to be real. You want it to be life oriented. So that's my interest. Now, a little bit about Brahms. And this is necessary to understand where he was coming from. He was born in 1833. His dad was a double bass player. There is a lot of information that says that he played in brothels and bars and so forth. That's likely not true, but we don't know for sure. But he started studying with a piano teacher, and that piano teacher got really mad at him, because every time he would give him something to play, Brahms would come back with his own compositions. And he said, you've got to stop this. If you're going to learn to play the piano, you've got to play the great works. Well, there was somebody named Edward Markson who learned of Brahms and took him under his wing, and he taught him composition. He taught him how to play the piano. Brahms was a spectacular virtuosic pianist, but he also cultivated that composition. And then a Hungarian violinist came by. His name was Remenyi. And Brahms and he went around and toured all over. And that's where Brahms got his interest in Hungarian dances, which he wrote a lot of those. He transcribed them. He wrote his own. But Remenyi was very important because he introduced him to Joseph Joachim, the famous violinist I've already talked about. So those were two violinists who knew each other. And Brahms came into the space of Joseph Joachim, and Joachim was blown away with what Brahms had written. And he said, this is unbelievable. I need to introduce you to Robert and Clara Schumann. Robert Schumann was the editor and of a major music magazine, a music criticism magazine, the most important one probably in the Western world at that time, and also a great composer, married to Clara, who was also a great composer and maybe the best pianist at that time, even over Liszt, depending on how you look at them. So Clara Schumann, Robert Schumann lived in Dusseldorf, and Brahms went to them 20 years old. He sat down and played things at the piano, and Clara and Robert were astonished. Clara wrote in her diary all kinds of things about this guy, and Robert decided he would go further. He wrote in his Neue Zeitschrift für Musik magazine that I mentioned, he wrote, "I have found the one who was to come, the one who would bring together all things under music and do it with a power." And he called him the young eagle. Basically, he said he was Jesus for music. He was the savior of Western music. And he had reason to say that. Brahms' writing was powerful and dramatic, and his early sonatas were just amazing. So what did that do to Brahms? That pronouncement that everybody read, everybody who was anybody in the music world knew about it, and they were all going, "What you gonna do next, buddy?" So in his article, Brahms was stated as having a symphonic scope. "We can't wait," Robert Schumann said, "until we hear his symphonies. What he's going to be the next Beethoven." I mean, he didn't say that, but he implied that. And Brahms at 20 and then 21, he was like, "I'm not ready for this." And it scared him to death. So he pulled back. He didn't want to publish anything, but he felt like he needed to write a symphony. So he started trying to do something like that, and he was unhappy with all of it. In the meantime, Robert Schumann, who he had met in 1853, when he was 20 years old, Robert Schumann in 1854 tried to commit suicide by throwing himself into the Rhine. They dragged him out, and he went into an insane asylum. Brahms had lived in Clara and Robert's home in Dusseldorf for quite a bit of time as he was getting to know them and so forth. And he was away when Robert tried to commit suicide. And so he hurried back there to be with Robert to try to help. At that time, in insane asylums, the wife was not allowed to go in. So Clara could not go see Robert. So Johannes went to see him and reported back and carried letters back and forth and tried to help. Clara had 7 children, and 8 had died, and she needed help. And so Brahms eventually was given a room on another floor of the house than where everybody else was living. And he lived in that house and served as the conduit to Robert and as the helper. And he spent lots of time in Robert Schumann's library, learning about the great works that he had not had a chance to know. And he saw that there were things in there that were contrapuntal that he really wanted to emulate. And so he started writing exercises. And he started writing things that would prepare him to be able to be a great symphonist. One of those ended up being his first piano concerto. But it started out as a 2-piano, 4-hand work. And at points it was called a piano sonata, it was called a symphony, and it ended up being the D minor piano concerto, which is yum bum 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 bum, ba-da-da, bum bum bum, and there's lots more to that. We have done that in Terre Haute several times. It's a great work, but he couldn't make a symphony out of it. He just couldn't find a way. So then he started his first serenade. That was a work that had it had a large orchestra, but he started it as a nonette, as an exercise. So 5 or 9 instruments. And he worked and worked on that to get it into some sort of shape and just was not happy with it. The small instrumentation was not quite what he needed. He needed more. And so then he orchestrated it fully and at first called it a symphony serenade. And then he scratched out the symphony part and it became his serenade number one. When he was doing those, he was also working on sketches. And we don't know how far back they go, but they may go back as far as before Robert Schumann actually tried to commit suicide. At any rate, in 58 and 59, so Brahms met them in 1853, in 1858, 59. He's invested lots and lots of time on that. And he decided to go with this work a different way. He decided that what he wanted to do was to have something that was bright and light and lovely from his perspective. And so he was able to come up with this work. Now, before we go there, I want to go back to the dissertation briefly and show you a quote. Let's see, this is on page 19, so let's get back to that. This is one person's writing about how Brahms was, how he was as a person. It's at the bottom of that. In fact, I'll go one more down, just a little bit more so that it goes to the next page. Try that again. This is where I said, you'll have to bear with me. Starting where it's the little small print in the top half of the page, the key to such a man's character must always be something of a mystery. Brahms made sure that he covered his tracks. By the way, he threw all of his letters away in the river. He dumped them in the river that were between him and Clara. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. A repressed romantic, a deeply emotional man held back by social disadvantage. He grew up in a very poor area, and an innate shyness, an intellectual at odds with a passionate soul. Brahms was all of these. If he eventually shrank back from any attempt to discuss his emotions, he continued to play out the drama of his inner life behind the mask of abstract music. In other words, he was saying how he was feeling, what was happening in what he termed abstract music. But you can see in the first symphony, we played that last May, and I talked about how it really draws attention to Clara. And this postcard that Brahms had sent to her with Alphorn theme that I believe he created. But anyway, he said, "From far away I come to you." Yum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-dum, and how the music demonstrates the turmoil that he experienced as he was trying to grapple with what was going on with Robert's insanity and eventual death, and his growing feelings for Clara. Now, just briefly about Clara. She was 37 and he was 20. 17 years apart, 16, 17. And he had lived in their home and knew what they were, who the people were in that home. He actually really loved Julie, Clara's daughter. And when Julie got married, he wrote a piece called the Alto Rhapsody. If you want to explore the Alto Rhapsody, it tells you how awful Brahms felt as he watched this girl he had hoped in some way to have a continuing relationship with be married off to somebody else. He was a very lonely person in a lot of ways, but it was by choice. He and Clara, at some point, made a decision that though they both knew they really loved each other, they also knew that neither would make a good spouse for the other. And Brahms needed space to be able to compose, and he recognized that, and Clara recognized that about him. And Clara wanted to have her career. I talked about that in preparation for the first symphony performance I just mentioned to you. But this made Brahms hypercritical. And so an awful lot of the music he wrote, he destroyed, he burned it. So nobody would ever see any trace of it. He burned an awful lot of his manuscripts that were the precedents to works like this one that we're talking about. So we have the piano concerto, we have the first serenade, we have the second serenade. I call the second serenade a symphony, his first symphony, in the disguise of a serenade. He made it a 5-movement work. A serenade is normally a light piece of music, often played outdoors, which is why it's wind-oriented. In this case, we have 2 flutes, and at the end, a piccolo, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, and then you have the cello, viola, and bass instruments that are part. So it's double woodwinds plus piccolo, 2 horns, and then the cello bass with viola. Many times those would be played outside, and the winds would carry, and the lower strings would carry. And that was a standard kind of light music, like we would have a DJ come and do a party. Well, they would have a small wind band like that come and play at parties. And that was the expectation of people. It's a serenade. It was a symphony in the disguise of a serenade. So for years, between when Schumann tried to commit suicide and when Brahms really published this, he was working on his compositional palette. He was learning how to compose the way he wanted to. He didn't publish his first symphony until 1868, and he started it in 1853. But he had this work, which we are now going to engage. I'm going to sing for you, and then we're going to have be played. Well, actually, I may play mine first. The score of the first serenade has, and you may be able to see this. So this is where it starts right here. And you see the clarinet at the beginning, and you see that little phrase mark over the top of those notes, and then another phrase mark, and then another phrase mark. They're 2-bar phrases. So this is how it would have been played for Brahms. This is the performance practice that we will be working on. It will be Notice how I'm shaping that. Now I'm going to play something for you. This is another performance. Well, I'm not going to be able to. Let's see what Sammy has. Sammy, why don't you play the opening of that again? And I won't be able to hear it, of course.
Okay. Here's the very beginning.
Okay. So most conductors do it this way. Without the small shaping. And in so doing, they lose the detail of the smaller areas, and they also lose the overall arch because it's just one going. It doesn't have the sense of building from time to time. So when you hear us do that, you will hear something that is very different. It just occurred to me. So events. He met the Schumanns, the suicide attempt. He was with the family. He left the family, and then he went to a place called Detmold, where he had a 3-month appointment for several years in October. He had a chance to hear things like this. He had a chance to write for a small orchestra, and he had a chance to write for a girls' chorus. And so as he was doing this work on the A major serenade, he was able to try things out. He also had Joachim, who he could go to for a possibility of hearing a private performance in Hanover, which is what happened at the early January of the year of the first performance. They did a private performance, and then they did a public performance of this. So the work has a natural beauty in the exposition at the very beginning, but then in the development, it has some issues. There are two basic sections, and they do not kind of grow through one to the other. There is this one area that is just stunning. And it goes ya da 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 da, but he doesn't go on long enough with it. So how do you make that work? That was the subject of my dissertation. And what it means is you have to take the tempos slightly different. So one of the things that you will notice in our performance of this is that the tempos will be adjusted rather dramatically in order to be able to make it really speak. And so if you're listening here now and you'd like to know where that was, come up to me after the concert and we'll talk about it, because this is an area of profound interest on my part. In fact, this is probably my life's work as a musician, to find out how to put a work like this in its best light. Now let's go to the beginning of the second movement.
I'll play a little clip here.
And while you're doing that, I'm going to show you, let's see, is that the right one? Yeah. At the top of that, it says, there it is, scherzo, and then the word vivace. Okay, that's enough of that. So I can't hear it, so I didn't hear what you heard, but here's the tempo. When you have vivace and you have a scherzo's in 3, but this isn't a 3 that's in 2. It should be da 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 da. Was that about the tempo they took it?
No, you took it faster.
Yeah, and that's the tempo it should be. Vivace is used by him. He almost never ever gives one particular thing, especially something as fast as vivace or presto in all of his music. He always qualifies it. So normally you would see vivace ma non troppo, really fast but not too much. Or the first one was allegro, but then he adds moderato. So frequently he makes sure that you don't think it should be too fast or too slow. He qualifies it. This one does not happen that way. And so vivace it is it's a very fast, very uplifting thing. And one of the reasons why many times the performances of this are 30 minutes is because people are taking the tempos a little on the slow side. Let's go to the third movement. Before we do the third movement, I will say that when Brahms finished his manuscript of this, he sent it to his very dear friend. They were now no longer in any way interested in any kind of romance. And more than likely, nothing ever happened there. We don't know for sure, but it's highly unlikely. And that's a whole different story we won't get into today. He sent this to Clara and said, I wrote this for you. And she responded just gushing with praise for this. She just thought it was the most beautiful thing. And again, I'm going to sing the tempo that I will do, which is it sings, it moves. Let's see what tempo you have.
All right. I'm going to guess it's going to go slower. Quite a bit slower. It's quite a bit slower. It's almost like a funeral march.
Exactly. So this was actually, I believe, a love note from Brahms to her saying, you know, I'm not there anymore, but I still have such feelings for you.
David,
and
I have a quick question. Do you think that's why the Wikipedia article says he wrote it for Clara, but really it was more one movement?
It was one movement, but he didn't dedicate it to her.
Okay.
He dedicated 3 or 4 sets of pieces. His Opus 118 is dedicated to Clara. And I think Opus 7 or 8, one of the two is dedicated to her as well. But this one was not. So anyway, but yes, maybe that's a reason somebody picked that up and said, yeah, he wrote it for her, so he must have dedicated it to her. All right. So that movement has such passion in it. Overall, this is a very, bright, but that one, there's a lot of drama to it. And then we come to, and here's another qualifier, it's a minuet. It's called minuetto, but then the qualifier is quasi minuetto. And so this is in 6/4. Well, a minuet isn't in six. It's not 6/4. It's 3/4. But he's doing it over multiple bars. And so here's the tempo that I will be using, which I believe is exactly what he wants. Da 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 dum, bum bum ba da da dum, bum bum da 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 dum. So it's floating. It's a minuet. You could actually dance to that. Let's hear what you have.
All right. Here's movement 4. Touch slower. As far off though as that third movement was, right?
I think that's enough on that. I think it would be helpful before we go to the last movement for me to just say a few things about performing this. One is you have to have a good seating for this so that people can see each other. This is not a huge orchestra. In our case, we're just going to have one viola, one cello, and one bass, which is a way that he said was possible to perform it. It wasn't his preference, but that's what we're doing because that makes it easy for us to make a chamber concert out of it, a group of 15 players. So the seating is something that will be a little bit, we've got to figure it out. Here's what I'm going to do on the seating. Now, I say this is what I'm going to do. What I will say is I'm going to propose this to the players and say, all right, let's try it this way. And then if you don't like it, let's find a different way. But you notice that we've got the viola, that VA stands for viola, and cello in the middle. The double bass is behind. The flutes are over here. Piccolo will come in just for the last movement. Oboes there, clarinets opposite, and bassoons in their place. And Sammy, you may want to be here across from oboe 1 when I think you will. And you may want to have Chad here so that you're next to each other. But we'll figure that out. And then horns out on the side so that we are able to hear and see each other well. And this will be on the Hatfield Hall stage. But the way in which we present this is not going to be thick and well, for instance, the opening of the last movement starts with that perfect fourth that we talked about in the first movement and which has occurred all the way through. But it goes yada, and then you have da da dum pa pa bum pa pa bum pa pa bum. It's written in 2/4, and you could conduct it yada dum bum pa bum pa pa bum pa pa bum. Well, we won't do that. That's too messy. It's going to be da da dum pa pa bum pa pa bum pa pa bum pa pa bum pa pa, so that it floats. And then the piccolo comes in right at the very beginning, but later on you'll hear at the very end. It's just spectacular, so much fun. The piccolo is just trilling away way high, and everybody else is just enjoying it. So let's listen to a little bit of the fifth movement.
All right, here's a little bit of the fifth movement. So a little bit under tempo still.
Now, can you go to like, I don't know, 30 seconds before the end of that movement? And let them hear the piccolo at the very end.
There it was. Let me go back just a little bit. There's the piccolo.
So when these are played, that's 5 movements on this. The Dvorak is 4 movements. It's very, very intensive for the musicians. They have their faces on the instruments a lot, and it wears you out. It's an endurance issue. So at one of the early performances Brahms did, it was the premiere in Vienna after he'd had several other performances of this work. He was there, the conductor was there, and the principal clarinet stood up and said he and a couple of others refused to play it. It was too much playing. It was too hard, and he did not want to do it. The conductor looked at the principal clarinet and then threw his baton down on the floor and said, "Okay, I quit. I won't do this." And he walked off. Needless to say,
I won't do that.
They ended up performing it, but it is an endurance issue. And so one of the things we had to figure out was how to rehearse for it so that we would not be too tired when we got to the performance. I think I'm going to stop here, and Sammy, if you will ask them if they have questions and relay them to me on this, and then if we run just a little over, we might listen to a little bit of each of the beginnings of the Dvorak as well.
Yeah, well, I have a really quick question for you. So while you guys are thinking of questions, if you think of one, let me know with your hand raised. So David, I had the opportunity to play this piece during my undergrad with a full orchestra. And I assumed there would have been no violins. I was young. I wasn't paying attention. I was more concerned about how much playing I was going to have to do on this part. But we would have done it with a full section of 8 violas, 10 cellos, 4 to 5 basses. Is that how you normally see it performed?
Well, yes, it is how we normally perform it today. However, that is not what Brahms said. Brahms said he wanted 8 violas, 6 cellos, 4 basses. That was his section. And then he said it could be fewer than that if necessary. There is some Debussy writing as a part of it, but it all can be done with one instrument because it's written intentionally by Brahms so that it could be done by a solo string player.
Interesting. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question about the Brahms Serenade for David? Or just about the performance in general? Yeah.
Has David ever recorded this?
David, have you recorded this piece?
I have not. Well, it has been recorded when I have performed it, but it's not a recording that is able to be shared. So, no, I have not recorded it, and I would love to.
Professionally in a studio. Now, we are planning to record the concert on March 19th, right, David? I believe
With
that's
video.
what. Yes, with video. So we will have this available on our YouTube page with David conducting. That's a good question. Any other questions? Oh. On the 19th. Yeah, March 19th. Yes. Yep, March 19th. All right, you want to listen to a little bit of the Dvorak, David? Let's
open with the march at the beginning of the first movement.
Right. So the second piece that we're going to be performing on this concert is Dvorak's Serenade for Winds, Opus 44. And this is the first movement.
Okay, that's probably enough for that.
Yep.
Now, what's interesting, Dvorak was really helped by Brahms. Dvorak was from a backcountry area, he's Bohemian, and he was not getting any traction. Brahms chose to meet with him when he was very young. Brahms was in his middle age, and Dvorak came, and Brahms loved his work. He was very complimentary, and he put him in touch with Simrak. I told you about Fritz getting his dad, Nikolaus, to publish him. Well, he did the same thing. Brahms did the same thing and got him published with Simrak. And Simrak made a boatload of money off of Dvorak, which nobody else would do. And this is one of the pieces that Simrak initially published. And it was very well received because, of course, it was small and people could play it in their homes.
Right.
Here's the second movement.
All right. Second movement.
And then for the third movement, this is one of the glories of Dvorak's writing. It is just so expressive and so beautiful. If we can find the third movement.
All right, here's the third movement.
Okay. As
The
you can
clarinet
hear,
solo wasn't done, David.
yeah,
I said the
as you
clarinet
can
solo
hear-
wasn't done.
as you can hear, there's a great clarinet solo right there at the beginning of it. And Sammy gets to go through. The oboe also has solos here. This does not have flutes. It's just oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, and there are 3 horns, and then cello bass, no viola on this one. So it's something like what Brahms has done. And then I won't have you play the last movement. It's very lively. But what's interesting to listen for is the way Dvorak at the very end brings back the first movement march, that yum bum ba-dum ba-da, brings it back to round it off, and then just chases to the end. It's absolutely thrilling. So we'll do this Dvorak first, and then we'll rearrange the chairs. We're not having an intermission, but we're going to have a pause to let everybody's jaw get a little relaxation and recuperation. And then we'll go into the Brahms at the performance. Anything else anybody would like to ask?
Anybody have any other questions for David? All right, well, let's give David a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us.